Hey, Vince McMahon, it's time for this week's Stick to Wrestling podcast.
Oh, no, give me a break.
Oh, brother. Welcome to Stick to Wrestling. My name is John McAdam. This is the Stick to Wrestling podcast, a weekly classic pro wrestling podcast where if you give us 60 minutes, perhaps indeed, we'll give you a wicked good and raw bone podcast. Before I get rolling, I want to invite you to join our Facebook group. It's called the Stick to Wrestling group. If you just search for it, ask to get in, you're in. A lot of good results, questions, answers, photographs, you name it, we got it over there. Free parking, pizza by the slice. You want to be part of this. And before I get rolling again, Twitter, follow me on Twitter. Just follow the guy with the Stick to Wrestling logo as his avatar. And returning now as the popular, sometimes co-host is my friend Steve Generelli. Steve, thank you for coming on.
Oh, thank you, John. And this particular episode should be right up my sweet spot, and I don't want to give it away, but I'm really excited about this one.
I'm excited too, and we have a third man in the booth. Our guest this week returning after about a 9-month hiatus from his maiden voyage on Stick to Wrestling. Dr. Nick Coliadis. Dr. Nick, thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me. I'm looking very much forward to this, and my parents are not wrestling fans, but they listened to the last podcast that I was on. I'm going to give them another one to listen to, so they're going to be thrilled.
Tremendous. Also, I've been talking about having this cold. Listen to this. The cold is more or less gone, but I still have some congestion, right? So yesterday, after being sick for 2 weeks, and then before that we had holiday interruptions, I get on my exercise bike for probably the first time in 2 weeks and probably the fourth time in 4 weeks. And I'm gassed at the 25-minute mark. Nick, I could have used you, man. I needed a doctor. I mean, I think it's less me being out of or getting out of shape in a month and this damn congestion that I can't get rid of.
You and everybody else, man. I mean, I've had that on and off all year long, and it's hard to kick out of that. But we all sound good today, I think.
Oh, I hope so. 25 minutes. Make fun of me on the Facebook group for that. That's pathetic. I did get through it, but 25 minutes into it, I was like, oh my God, I'm dying. Recently, Peacock released a bunch of Championship Wrestling, WWF Championship Wrestling episodes from 1980. I've been wanting to do this for a while. They did this 3 weeks ago. We are going to review the February 2nd, 1980 episode. By coincidence, this was a historic episode of Championship Wrestling with the famous Bruno Sammartino versus Larry Zabisco match. Dr. Nick, one reason I specifically wanted you on this show, we've got me who lived through it. We've got Steve who lived through this. And with you, I have a fresh set of eyes.
One thing that I realized when I go back and I watch a lot of this wrestling that's before my time, even though it is before my time, more often than not, I can see what made these guys great. It's not very difficult to see why Bruno Sammartino was as over as he was. And I think the one thing that immediately struck me about him is that I liked him because he reminds me of Bret Hart. And on the surface, that may sound a little bit strange. Different wrestlers, different eras, different styles, different careers, different legacies. But the one thing they have in common is both guys aren't exactly the smoothest promos in the world. They don't sound like Ric Flair, Jim Cornette, where everything just flows. But what they make up for is they sound genuine. They sound like a real guy in a real fight for something that really matters in a real sport. And that just comes right through the camera. So that was kind of my first impression of Bruno Sammartino. He reminds me of Bret Hart. And that's one of the reasons I like him.
As soon as you said that, in some ways he reminds me of Bret Hart as well. And I agree with what you said as far as, they come across as being genuine. I mean, Steve, do you see that comparison?
When he said it, it took me back a little bit, but no, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, both were very genuine guys. Both were surrounded by these larger than life, caricatures and crazy managers and people who are really over the top. So when you're dealing with a Bruno or a Bret Hart who is more down to earth and laid back, they came across very like a normal person, whereas these other wrestlers were just like wild and uncontrollable.
And I look at this too, like think about 90s WWF or early and mid 90s WWF where everyone had a gimmick except Bret Hart, and Bruno Sammartino was not a gimmick guy at all.
Not at all. He wasn't anything like that. And again, that makes him stand out, and especially someone like me that grew up with the gimmicks. Again, when you watch the stuff from the 70s and the previous era, and even the early 80s, it just seems more realistic. You know, it just seems like a more realistic presentation. Even the opening to that show, just the way it's presented, where they introduce the promoter, the commissioner, the timekeeper, the referees. It's much more of a sports presentation versus maybe the kind of variety show or the entertainment show that we see today.
We're going to talk about them introducing everybody. I actually have a lot to say about that. The first thing I did want to say, though, like Peacock, thank you for, getting these 10 episodes, but could you please make your stuff a little bit easier to find? If you could just have a search feature just in the WWE section, I would appreciate it so much. Steve, did you find this okay?
Yeah, I just put in championship in the search, and it did bring up lots of matches, but it did bring the championship wrestling logo, and it was easy. It was fairly easy to find after that.
All right, Nick, any problems for you?
Yeah, I mean, I found it pretty easily, but the format leaves a lot to be desired. I mean, it sounds funny to say, but I'm pining for the days of the network.
No, it's not funny to say. The network was way easier to navigate. And again, I don't want to throw out a problem without a solution. My solution, just have a search feature just in WWE, not in Peacock in general. First thing, I noticed that they did not use the original music. No surprise there, but let's hear some audio from this episode. We have a lot of good audio. I should have mentioned this earlier. Not only do we have the audio from, or some of the audio from, the February 2nd 80s show, I've got some audio going back where we tell the story of what happened coming into the Larry Zabisco versus Bruno Sammartino match. But right now, let's hear Vince McMahon introducing this episode.
Welcome to Championship Wrestling. Vince McMahon here at ringside, and scheduled on this week's championship card, we'll be seeing the likes of Tony Atlas. He is really something else. Mr. USA, Tony Atlas. Tony Atlas joining the card this week by the likes of the fabulous Hulk Hogan over most of these same stations. You'll be seeing Big Bob Duncum. Ken Patera, the Olympic strongman, will join us. All this and a whole lot more in addition to the match. Indeed, the fans here jam-packing this arena, a capacity crowd on hand to see what they anticipate to be one of the greatest matches ever held on television. Larry Zabisco will square off against wrestling's living legend Bruno Sammartino. We shall return with the opening contest as we continue in just a moment.
Nick, I know you know who Howard Cosell is, but you didn't grow up in an era where everyone knew who Howard Cosell was. He was one of the biggest names in sport. Steve, is it me or is Vince trying so hard to be Howard Cosell?
Yeah, and he's hitting it out of the park. I mean, looking back at what we know now with all the other promoters, you've seen footage from other promotions. I think Vince did a phenomenal job making this show seem like it was something special, and that this match was going to be something unique. And I mean, I'm sure that where they taped this match in Hamburg probably didn't have any more fans than normal, but he made it seem like it was a special event and was just jam-packed. But it was probably the same amount of fans like they always had there.
Steve, I will bet you that coming into the building, I bet those people didn't even know they were going to see Bruno Sammartino versus Larry Zabisco. I mean, they were building the angle up as they went. So unless it was from the first hour, they probably had no idea. Any thoughts on a very young, 43 years ago Vince McMahon, Nick?
Well, here's my thoughts on Vince. It's interesting because when you hear him talking, he doesn't sound like a deer in headlights. He seems like he's got some confidence about him, but it's not the Vince McMahon that we saw even before he became that Mr. McMahon character.
Oh, no.
He's not quite not quite there yet in terms of confidence, you know, and you could see where he's kind of imitating Howard Cosell. You know, he's kind of got that cadence, but he slips in and out of it. You know, it's almost like when you see those early Ric Flair promos and he's still trying to figure it all out. That's kind of what I'm looking at here with Vince. He's not quite familiar with who Vince McMahon is supposed to be as of yet. Does that make sense?
It totally makes sense to me. I mean, Vince McMahon, just 5 years later, he would be talking with that Vince McMahon voice. Oh, but like, you know, now he's just a regular sportscaster. I mean, and Steve, one thing, you were around. I mean, you started watching wrestling right around the same time I did. So you've been a fan for about 4 years. Is it safe to say that the upcoming Bruno Sammartino versus Larry Zabisco match is the biggest TV match we've ever seen?
Oh yeah, it would be by far. And, it just, you know, when John and I started, Bruno was the champion, and he very rarely made a TV appearance, maybe an interview here, a rare TV match. But, you know, pretty soon he would lose the title. Billy Graham had a year as champion, and he would be on quite, you know, a lot more than Bruno was. And then Bob Backlund would be on fairly regularly after that. So to see Bruno, who was the legend of the Northeast, make this rare TV match against was his protege, it just boggled the mind. We had no clue what was going to happen next.
I certainly had no clue. All right, I want to play a couple of things that we heard every single week on Championship Wrestling. Lou, if you could play that audio for us.
The following wrestling exhibition requires discretionary viewer participation.
Steve, it took me forever to figure out what exactly that meant. I mean, I guess just don't have, like, you know, really violent little kids watching this or something. Like, I knew they wanted to get in the exhibition part as subtly as they possibly could, because I think there were some states where you had to say that. But, I mean, the rest of it I just didn't get.
No, and I didn't get it either. Maybe I still don't get it, but you know, it just at the time, wrestling was looked at as such a weird fringe thing. I mean, it aired on independent stations in the middle of the night or in the early morning, and it was just in another world. I mean, people didn't talk about it. I mean, the fans like us that were diehards would buy all the magazines, and we would try to learn every little snippet we could find out, but it was just so foreign, and I almost felt like they had to give a disclaimer just in case the normal public, you know, watched any of this and they had to know that something was right with the world, I guess.
I mean, really, you know, people like to talk about wrestling being mainstream in the Northeast in 1980, and let me tell you, it wasn't. I don't care. I don't care how many people watched it. I don't care how many people went to Madison Square Garden or the Boston Garden. It was fringe entertainment, and you didn't want the wrong people to know that you watched it, Steve.
Yeah, it was really on the edge there, and you know, looking back on it now, maybe that's where it belonged. I don't know. You know, it was good for what it was, but, you know, I think in the mid '80s, I think wrestling kind of like found a really nice spot in the middle where it showed a lot more entertainment. It gave you some good quality matches. You know, definitely the work rate in the WWF was a lot better by the mid '80s compared to this period we're talking about. But it's just fun to revisit this period because it's definitely a transitionary period from the end of the Bruno era to the sweet spot of the Backlund era.
It was. And, you know, like I said, people loved it, but it was lowbrow entertainment, as lowbrow as it got. I'll tell you what, Nick had alluded to something that we heard every single week on Championship Wrestling until about 1984. Let's hear Joe McHugh introduce just about everyone in the audience. Let's go. You can play that, Lou.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is Championship Wrestling, promoted by Phil Zybysko, supervised and controlled by the State Athletic Commission, and the officials assigned, Deputy Commissioner in charge, John Santoro, the doctor in attendance at ringside, Dr. George Soharian, the timekeeper at the bell, Mike McMahon, referees for this hour of wrestling, Dick Worley, Gilberto Roman, Dick Pro, Tony Altamore, and my name is Jericho.
Okay, Nick, you were talking about this earlier. I had two thoughts on this. I watched this show 3 times getting ready for this podcast, and I was actually watching it just to watch it, and I said, wait a minute, I should have a podcast about this. This is about 3 weeks ago. My initial reaction when they ran that down, when they spent about 2 minutes of television time so that everyone knew who Mike Mittman was, I was like, look, I mean, I know the Pennsylvania State Athletic Commission required them to do that, but if I'm Vince McMahon Sr., I tell those guys, look, I have a television show to run without this in the middle of it or at the beginning of it, whatever, and Delaware's right there, New Jersey's right over there, Maryland's right there, New York's here, and there are more states north of that. I will move this program someplace where we don't have to do this every week, right? That's what I said the first time. Then today when I watched it again, I'm like, wait a minute. This makes it all sound very authentic in some sort of weird way, like it did with you, Nick.
That's the impression I got. And then the other thing I noticed was the fight doctor. Doctor, you know, I'm listening to all this out of here. Dr. George Sahorian. My first thought is, we know what happens there. But yeah, you know, the other thing I love is the old school microphone dropping from the ceiling.
Yes.
There's something about that. I'm also a big fight fan. So actually, I'm very familiar with Howard Cosell because I've seen all the old Muhammad Ali fights and all that. And just the microphone dropping from the ceiling, for some reason for me, that just immediately gives it that old fight feel. And I actually like that. I like the vibe.
No,
I feel like wrestling nowadays is too produced. It's too overproduced.
Yeah, I agree with you. And this, to me, it gave it kind of upon the second watching, I'm like, no, this gives it a gritty old school feel. Leave it in there. Steve, I mean, your thoughts about what we went through every week. I remember liking it at the time.
Well, I was watching it when you told me what the theme of this episode would be, and I think Scott Cornish deserves some kind of Lifetime Achievement Award when he did the Joe McHugh impersonation on the 605. I mean, he was so dead on. Joe McHugh, I mean, he's really over the top with his pronunciation. He kind of sounds like Dr. Smith from Lost in Space a little bit, but it's quite different than what we're used to with Howard Finkel and some of the other ones.
Dr. Smith from Lost in Space. I haven't thought of that show in forever. Even when I was a little kid, I did not like that show. Now, and believe me, this is not going to be all audio, but, and by the way, anytime we play audio, it is for review and educational purposes only, as some of you may know. Well, let's start off with the first match. It's Ken Patera against Stoneham, Massachusetts' own Fred Marzino, but in my opinion, Joe McHugh pulls a little bit of a gaffe here. Lou, if we could play that audio.
Portland, Oregon, weighing 260 pounds. Ladies and gentlemen, here is one of the strongest men in the world, Ken Patera.
Perhaps indeed I am too critical and too analytical, but the heel 101 in me says if I'm Ken Patera, I immediately grab that mic and say, not one of the strongest men. Steve, am I right?
That's right. Yeah, and I noticed in that match, too, they were doing a little interplay between the Wizard and the Patera, and it wasn't as good as the interplay a Wizard had with superstar Billy Graham, where he was having so much difficulty ripping off the shirt, but they had a little interesting chemistry with each other.
We have an incoming call here on the Wrestling.
The fans demanded it.
I'm back in action. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you just fine. All right.
Okay,
you know what? Let's leave that in. That was too funny. All right. So, Nick, you had some comments about Grand Wizard and Ken Patera, their interaction, shall we say, coming in. What were your thoughts on that?
I absolutely love this because whether the fans know it or not, they're part of the whole little heat cycle they do here. You know, Grand Wizard starts taking off Patera's jacket nice and slowly, folding it all carefully. You hear the audience catcalling. Patera starts getting pissed. He starts jaw-jacking with the fans. The catcalling gets louder. What does Ernie Roth do? He gets down on one knee, starts slowly taking the warm-up pants off. The catcalling gets louder. Patera gets even more pissed. And so it's just this whole little heat cycle they do at the beginning of the match just to get the crowd into it. And again, whether the crowd knows it or not, they're part of the whole machine. I thought it was very interesting, and I think that's something that's lost in wrestling today. Just these little subtle things that you can do just to get the audience to get pissed off at you. And again, you can not know anything about Ken Patera. You could have never seen the Grand Wizard, and immediately you know, okay, these guys are the heels.
And just so everyone knows, Ken Patera beckoned Grand Wizard to get down on one knee and to remove his warm-up pants. And this episode was actually kind of more subtle than some of the other ones. I mean, Steve, there were times where I was afraid Ken Patera was going to put that poor man's eye out.
Well, one thing that was very interesting to watch was the fans at ringside. I mean, lots of husbands and wives who looked like they'd been married for 25, 30 years.
Yes.
It looked like they, a lot of middle-aged folks, older folks. It looked like, maybe they had a bowling night the night before and they came to wrestling this night and they're probably go play pool the next night. You never know what they're going to do. But it's definitely a different audience than, say, AEW today, where it's like 50,000 young guys about all age 40 and there's a bunch of guys, In wrestling back in the old days, it was families and older people. It was kind of interesting.
That is so true. And I looked at the audience, and I'm just like, okay, wow, the really young people in there are now grandparents, and anyone who's middle-aged, I mean, they're probably not with us anymore.
That's true. Very true.
While we're talking about the Grand Wizard and Ken Patera, let's get Vince McMahon's reaction to what's going on with these two.
Sometimes you have to wonder a little bit about the personal relationship of the Grand Wizard and Ken Patera.
Anytime Vince said something like that, it cracked me up. I mean, you know what he's insinuating.
Right, yeah, I know. It's too much.
All right, so, we have Ken Patera against Fred Marzino. Ken Patera had recently returned to the WWF. He'd been around for about 6 weeks. He left in 1978 and came back at the very end of 1979. He actually came back with his natural short brown hair, and the first thing he does when he gets on the road with the WWF is he bleaches it blonde like a heel should. Any thoughts on this match, Ken Patera versus Fred Marzino, Nick? I mean, they don't have squash matches anymore. They haven't for a long time.
No, and I think squash matches are important because that's how you build up a big monster like a Ken Patera, just a big, nasty powerhouse monster that doesn't care if he injures his opponent, or in this case, seems to enjoy it. And what I thought was interesting is I kind of watched this match and I thought, okay, nowadays, how would you get someone like that over? Probably a press slam over the head, over the top rope, through the announcer's table. You have to do so much less here. I mean, look at what he does at the end of the match. He puts him in a full Nelson, picks him up off the ground, and just spins in a circle with him. I've done that to my little brother in the living room. He was fine. But they sell it. They sell every bit of it. Freddie Marzino sells it. The Grand Wizard sells it. My favorite part of this match is the very, very end. Watch the Grand Wizard's reaction right as the stretcher comes out. It's priceless. Because he points at it, he gives a big belly laugh, and he just starts clapping his hands. Like, that made his day.
Now, as we all know, Dr. Nick is a medical professional. Dr. Nick, what are your thoughts about just two referees, not even licensed medical personnel, just like tossing this guy onto the stretcher the way I toss things into the trash?
Yeah.
With a neck injury.
Credentials. I don't know about that. The other thing that threw me for a loop was later on when you see, and we'll get to this later on, is when they're cleaning up the Sammartino, where they're cleaning up the blood. I'm looking, it's like these guys aren't even wearing gloves. If you remember, this is 1980.
Right.
Exactly. I have something more to say on that as this fine podcast rolls on. Steve, I mean, we grew up on squash matches. It's all we knew about pro wrestling. You know, the good matches, you got to pay to see them. The TV is basically a showcase for stars like Ken Patera. But to me, if I'm Fred Marzino and I wrestle Ken Patera and I get no offense in, and this guy stretches me out, you know, injures my neck so bad, I'm just like, this is not the profession for me. I'm sending out my resume this week.
Well, recently, Mario Mancini, who became a really big jobber for WWF in the mid-'80s, he's done a whole bunch of shoot interviews, and he's extremely enthusiastic about his time in the WWF. I guess he did, you know, jobbing on TV for like 6 years, and he really embraced it. I mean, he was so naive. He thought wrestling was a shoot the first time he came to the TV tapings. He thought he could take Greg Valentine. He didn't know that, you know, wrestling was a work. So I guess a guy like Marzino, you know, it depends on how smart he was. You know, you're there to do a job. You're there to put Patera over and help Patera get to the main event. And yeah, I miss the squash matches. I really do.
I mean, that's funny. I've never seen, I never even was aware that Mario Mancini had shoot interviews. I will seek those out, but to me, that's hilarious. I've never wrestled before, but I think I can beat Greg Valentine.
Oh yeah. He would have got his ass whipped for sure by Greg Valentine. But you know, I'm sure most of our listeners are probably fans of like 90s wrestling. And I will say this. When wrestling got to be so big at the peak with Stone Cold and The Rock, those guys were very, very smart. You know, we're talking about Patera with the swinging full Nelson. They went back to these classic finishing moves. I mean, the people's elbow was just an elbow. You had the Kurt Angle with the angle lock. They didn't have to find these, like, you know, let's go through 20 tables like Nick was referring to. Make it simple, make it relatable, and the fans, you know, they ate it up. And this is what Patera's doing in this match. It's very relatable, very believable.
I mean, you know, if you have two guys with reasonably the same amount of strength, the full Nelson is going to be the end of any street fight. And I used to go back and forth with Fred Marzino by email. No, certainly not a shoot interview, but he says he embraced his role as a jobber. I don't mean that disrespectfully. And, you know, he said that sometimes Vince McMahon Jr. would yell at him because Fred liked to take big bumps. And it's like, hey, Fred, you're not here to take big bumps. You're just here to put the stars over. Don't make it about yourself. But Fred couldn't help himself sometimes.
No, this was a good match. This was a good jobber match, and he had a decent build. I mean, he looked like an athlete, and Patera just manhandled him. He just ate him up alive.
Yeah, and Ken Patera had already wrestled Bob Backlund at Madison Square Garden once. They have a rematch coming up at Madison Square Garden. Once again, for review purposes only, let's hear a little bit about that upcoming Madison Square Garden show with Bob Backlund defending against Ken Patera in a rematch, but we have a special guest referee, the newly turned Pat Patterson. Lou, if we can get that audio.
When Championship Wrestling returns to Madison Square Garden on the 18th of February, scheduled to compete on the Pro Wrestling Spectacular. Everyone looking forward to the return of the mighty midget wrestlers competing in the special tag team match. We'll also see Tony Atlas, a man who really made an impression for himself in his first appearance in Madison Square Garden, lock up with Iran's Great Hussein. Tito Santana will square off against the fabulous Hulk Hogan. Lou Albano sends his Samoans into individual competition. Afa meeting Rene Goulet. Sika squaring off against the Polish power, Ivan Putski. In addition to that, ladies and gentlemen, and a whole lot more, unquestionably, we're looking forward to the main event. The World Wrestling Federation title once again up for grabs on the 18th of February in the return match. Ken Patera will perhaps justifiably get another opportunity to wrestle Bob Backlund for the title in the return match. However, there will be a special guest referee. That guest referee assigned Pat Patterson. So here to discuss the main event with us now, the Intercontinental title holder himself, Pat Patterson, the guest referee. And Mr. Patterson, seems to me that you're in a not so enviable position here in Madison Square Garden because as many times as we'll have it, the official is, it's kind of a thankless job. You're in there and you're going to be knocked around perhaps as the last referee was.
Well, there's no doubt about it. It's going to be a tough job. First of all, I'd like to say this. You know, I've had my battles with Bob Backlund And I must say one thing, that I must respect the man, because he gave me some of the toughest match I ever had in my wrestling career. So he's truly a real champion. Now, talking about Ken Patera. Now, Ken Patera is also a great wrestler and one of the strongest men in the world today. Now, I saw the last match they had the last time at the Madison Square Garden. And I'll tell you, I kind of hate to say this, but if the referee would have been knocked down, Ken Patera would be the new world's champion. So because the referee got knocked out of the ring, the match was called a draw. The referee got carried out in the stretcher. Now, I was asked to be the referee. Well, I'll be the referee on this match. And the way I'm going to look at this match, Vince, is I'm going to look at it as a wrestler's point of view. Now, these guys, they want to go at it like two dogs. They can do it if they want. But I promise you one thing. I'll be standing up at the end of the match, and I'll give the belt to the man that becomes the winner. And that man will be the world's champion, of course. And I'll guarantee you, as far as I'm concerned, it's going to be one of the toughest matches I've ever seen. And I'm glad I'm going to be the referee to see it.
So, indeed, you are going to, what, be objective in this situation, or are you going to be a bit partial toward Ken Patera, toward Bob Backlund? How does Pat Patterson see it?
Vince, I'm not going to be partial to anyone. I'm going there to do a job, to be a referee. And like I said before, the best man is going to win this match. I'm not going to favor nobody. I know, like I said before, I've had my battles with Backlund, but it's all down the drain now. That was yesterday. Now it's a new day, and I'm going there to do my job as a referee, and the best man is going to win.
Thank you very much. There you have it, ladies and gentlemen, from the Intercontinental title holder, indeed the guest referee, Pat Patterson, in the main event.
All right, that wasn't from the network. That was, or from Peacock. That was from my personal stash, as they say. Steve, I mean, it's the WWF 1980 at the I believe it was the very end of 1979, or maybe even the beginning of 1980. Pat Patterson had turned babyface. We're talking maximum 4 or 5 weeks ago, and now he's on TV, and he's a completely different person.
Yeah, he had been a hated villain in the WWF, but then, as John would attest to, at the beginning of one of the episodes with Vince and Bruno running down this week's wrestling show, Pat Patterson comes out and he says that that fat slob Lou Albano acquired his contract, and just by downgrading Lou Albano and insulting him, he became an instant babyface. People adored him. It's like he set the captives free, and that's how quickly things changed back then.
Yeah, and let's get to the next match. Pat Patterson against Jose Estrada. I mean, as we mentioned, Patterson had just turned, and the fans had forgotten all of the horrible things he had just done. Just months ago, he had used brass knuckles to knock out Ted DiBiase and steal the then North American Championship. Then he goes to Madison Square Garden, uses the same brass knucks to try to steal the WWF Championship from Bob Backlund, and but now, hey, we all love this guy.
Yeah, they had some great matches at MSG that the people still talk about, the Patterson versus Backlund 4-match set at the Garden, which had never been done before, I don't believe. 4 matches. Nope. So it was just phenomenal. And as John would testify from the Backlund book, Backlund himself said that Patterson taught him so much in the cage match. Backlund didn't understand that you could rev the fans up and, take them to a boiling point and really tell a story in the ring. So, between guys like Patera that he worked with and Patterson that he worked with, Backlund was becoming a really good worker in the ring and really starting to understand what he needed to do to tell stories in the ring.
No, I agree. And by the way, we're about to hear Bob Backlund speaking about the upcoming match against Ken Patera at Madison Square Garden. They had 3 excellent matches during the year of 1980. This would be the second of the 3. The matches are out there. I recommend that any old school wrestling fan seek those out if you have not seen them already. Well, let's hear what Bob Backlund has to say about his upcoming defense against Ken Patera with the newly turned Pat Patterson as guest referee.
Now let's bring on the champion. Let's bring on the World Wrestling Federation title holder, Bob Backlund. And Mr. Backlund, you unquestionably will look forward, I suspect, to once again meeting Ken Patera in Madison Square Garden. The last match called a draw.
Yes, I am. I'm really looking forward to, that the last match was a tough one, and I have a lot of respect for him. He's a great wrestler, and it got a little out of hand. The referee got knocked down, and the wrestlers had to come down.
If I may interrupt you just right there. The referee was knocked down. Ken Patera, either rightly or wrongly, claims that you, Bob Backlund, intentionally knocked the referee down. Backlund, you intentionally, to save your title, knocked the referee down.
That's not true, Vince McMahon. I think we can get the films out and show that was Ken Patera that threw me into there. I did hit the referee, I admit that, and I did knock him down. But it was Ken Patera throwing me into the referee that did knock him down. I did knock the referee down.
Now with Pat Patterson and his guest referee, that certainly changes.
That's not going to happen. That's not going to happen. Pat Patterson is a tough man. One of the toughest people that I've ever been in the ring with. And I've wrestled him a lot of times right here in Madison Square Garden. And he's a hard man to knock down. He's not going to get knocked down. There's going to be a definite winner in this match. I don't have no love for Pat Patterson. He says he's going to call it the way he sees it, right down the line, and he's going to call it like a wrestler would want a ref to call it. Well, that's fine with me if he's going to do that, because we're going to find out who the better man is, and I know Pat Patterson's going to be on his feet to raise the winner's hand, and I pray to God it's me.
Thank you very much.
Okay, once again, all audio used on Stick to Wrestling is for review purposes only, and that one's not on the network. That's from my personal stash, as they say. I really liked the fact that Bob Backlund just says, I had no love for Pat Patterson. He would at some point, but, Bob Patterson gave Backlund a pretty rough summer of 1979. Nick, the interviews have been so different in wrestling, certainly over the past at least 35 years, than they were in 1980. Give us your thoughts on, like, the old school, Patterson is the referee and Bob Backlund, the old school presentation, if you will, of the interviews.
Well, one thing that I noticed right off the bat, and I noticed this with Jerry Lawler in Memphis, I noticed this with Bob Backlund here, I noticed it with, there was an Ole Anderson promo I was watching from a little while back. They're very good at getting a lot of exposition in there. You know what I mean? Without making it too obvious. You can know absolutely nothing about what's going on, and then you can hear one of these promos, and they kind of give you the who, the what, the where, the when, and the why. It's not just a bunch of catchphrases. It's not just, a bunch of insults, a bunch of cool, lines to kind of pop a crowd. They're actually giving you a lot of exposition, and they're explaining to you what's going on. So you can follow along with the storyline. I think they serve that function much better. Backlund's not the most colorful guy in the world, but again, you present him as he's a legitimately good wrestler that's very difficult to beat and take the title off of. You go with his strengths here. So he may not be the most exciting guy to listen to, but you believe him.
Steve, I mean, you get it. You grew, you're pretty much the same age as me. We have a lot of common interests. I've said this on the show before. Bob Backlund gives an interview that's very similar to one that you would get from a Bobby Orr or a Tom Seaver or someone like that.
Yeah, he was very sincere, and you believed him that he was the champion. You believed he was the best thing going at that very time because he was obviously young in his prime. When we watch Bruno later on in this show, Bruno's kind of like Johnny Unitas. He's like the old pro coming off the bench for one last hurrah, so to speak. But Backlund is definitely the number one guy in the promotion at this point. And, his interviews, definitely not interview of the year material, but very sincere, very realistic and believable.
Yeah, Bob's interviews deteriorated, in my opinion, as the 80s marched on, or at least into the mid-80s. But here, I think he's doing a really good job. He comes across as a real athlete. Now, on to the next match, Pat Patterson versus Jose Estrada. Once again, Patterson had just turned, but the fans embrace him. I thought this was a really good match, and Jose Estrada takes this crazy bump over the top rope. Nick, what were your thoughts on Patterson and Jose Estrada?
Well, again, and I said this last time I was on, I think a great litmus test for a match is that you should be able just to hit the mute on the commentary, not know anything going in, and you can immediately tell who the face is, and you can immediately tell who the heel is. And Estrada was just a complete dirtbag. He just jumps Patterson right off the bat before he even has a chance to get the jacket off. He's aggressive. He's vicious on offense. But, man, the minute Patterson's had enough, slams down the jacket, all of a sudden Estrada loses all of his courage and starts backing off in the corner. So you can immediately tell who the face is. You can immediately tell who the heel is. The other thing I like is Patterson's not a candy-ass white meat baby face here by any means. He gets a little bit nasty as well. He rakes the eyes. You know, he gets a little bit nasty, but hey, Estrada started it.
That's a good way of looking at it. You know, I mean, anyone who watches WWF, I mean, I don't mean to overemphasize this, but Pat Patterson was just a bad guy, and he didn't forget about his bad guy tactics. I mean, Steve, we're getting off the episode, but I mean, you talked a little bit about your thoughts on Pat Patterson turning just a few weeks earlier. Lou Albano's not on this show, but it speaks volumes about, frankly, how much everyone hated Lou Albano. Oh, this guy's Albano's enemy now? Well, we're on his side.
Yeah, and I've heard you, John, on another podcast mention Lou Albano was essentially the de facto number one heel of the WWF, kind of like how Bobby Heenan was like the number one heel of the WWF during the Hogan era. He'd have a number one challenger always against Hogan. Well, in these
that's
olden
a really
days,
good comparison.
Yeah, in these olden days, whether it was Backlund as champion or Bruno as champion, Albano was always the most hated of the three wise men managers. And people just hated Lou Albano. I mean, he took advantage of the job guys. Yeah, he'd always kick them when they were down, and he just was the roughest on the interviews. Blassie had a little charm. In the Wizard, people probably felt sorry for him because he was so small and puny. But Albano, just everybody hated him. So he was the number one heel of the WWF back then.
He sure was. I mean, I think people had some sort of appreciation for Wizard as being kind of a class act and Blassie being a former wrestler, which Albano was too, but they just didn't emphasize it, and Lord knows he wasn't the star Blassie was. But yeah, I mean, to me, Albano stood out from the pack. Any thoughts on this particular match, Steve? I thought for a WWF 1980 match, this was a really good match.
Yeah, I mean, they're both good workers, and I agree with you, John, that spot that Estrada did was incredible. Just a vertical leap outside the ring. You didn't see that kind of a bump quite often on a WWF show.
No.
But it was a good win for Patterson, and we just like we were talking about with Patera, you have to put over the good guys too. You have to elevate to both the heels and the baby faces. So it was a good win for fan favorite Pat Patterson.
Now, let's go to the next match, Hulk Hogan against Angelo Gomez. Now, Hulk Hogan is new to the wrestling business. When he first came in November 1979, I had never seen or heard about him. I later learned that he had a short run on Georgia television earlier in 1979, and I know he wrestled in Memphis and in Alabama, but I had never seen the guy before, no pictures in the magazine, and he's new to the business, he's new to the WWF, and he is huge. Your thoughts on 1980 Hulk Hogan? Definitely different than the NWO Hulk Hogan, Nick.
I would definitely say so. And here's what's interesting is look at the juxtaposition of these matches. The match before this, we saw Pat Patterson. And Pat Patterson more or less looks like your typical 1970s wrestler, right? A little bit bigger than your average guy, but doesn't look like a bodybuilder that spends half his life in the gym and the other half in the tanning bed. But then now we see Hulk Hogan, and this is a completely different look. And it's kind of a harbinger of things to come because as the 80s wear on, you start seeing the Road Warriors, Lex Luger, Sting, Sid, the Ultimate Warrior, Rick Rude. You start seeing these comic book physiques, these guys that if you've never seen 5 seconds of wrestling, but you saw them in an airport, you'd immediately know, okay, this guy's a professional wrestler. Whereas the guys from the 70s tended to look more like Pat Patterson, Gene Anderson, Stan Hansen. You had your standouts. You had your superstar Billy Grahams and your Tony Atlases. But by and large, I think what we're seeing here is your typical 1970s wrestler and then your typical 1980s wrestler.
You know, Nick, we see him later in the episode, but I had an experience, I want to say it was either 78 or 79 when I lived in North Attleboro, Massachusetts, and I'm just walking by a gas station. I kind of look out of the corner of my eye. I'm like, wow, that guy's kind of short, but man, he's huge. And I was like, oh, wait a minute, that's Steve King. It's like, it took me a minute for it to, because he looked like just another big guy, Steve.
Yeah, the job guys were deceptively big, I guess. I mean, they might look small on TV, but if you saw them in person, they certainly looked different. And this guy wrestling against Hogan, he had a great build on him, but Hogan just completely manhandled him like a rag doll. And a name that we don't talk about too often on Stick to Wrestling, Colonel Buck Robley. He said that New York wrestling, you didn't have any wrestling, you just had large people going up against each other and tossing each other around. And this match is kind of a good example of that. I mean, Hogan isn't so much wrestling. I mean, it's just like he's just completely manhandling this guy.
Oh, Hogan completely ragdolled Angelo Gomez. And at the end of the match, his finisher was the over-the-shoulder backbreaker, and Hogan is using his left arm to hold the guy up and his right arm to pose. It was too much. Steve, I would never have guessed Hulk Hogan was going to turn into what he turned into. I don't think anyone was going to guess that. But I mean, at this point, I'm looking at Hulk Hogan. I'm like, man, he is going to be a big star in the wrestling business. Of course, as a bad guy, but I'm picturing, okay, what's his next move after he goes from the WWF?
It's just so funny to hear these interviews now when you talk to guys in other territories that they didn't realize. I mean, you and I we were just fans, but we knew he was going to be something special. But a lot of the guys within the business, like the Ole Andersons and some other people, Greg Gagne had said it. They thought that he was just this large guy that didn't have any talent. But once he learned everything, I mean, he learned a lot in Florida from Hiro Matsuda. But Vern helped him learn a lot. He learned in WWF, and by the time he came back in lots of Japan tours, by the time he came back, he was very well seasoned. And when he became champion, and he had a great career. I mean, neither one of us knew he was going to be champion, but he did have that special something. We just couldn't put our finger on it.
I don't mean to go off on the whole Ole Anderson, Hulk Hogan thing, but I will very briefly. Ole Anderson says, well, I had Hulk Hogan in Georgia in 1979. He was the shits, and I sent him home. It's like, okay, Ole, but you burned all of that television time on Hulk Hogan. Why didn't you just take a look at him and send him home after 1 week? No, he was on TV for like 2 months. Sorry, Ole, your claim does not stand up to any scrutiny.
I think in those days, being 6'7" like Hogan was, they just thought that those guys were super heavyweights. You have Hogan, you have Blackjack Mulligan, you have Ernie Ladd, you have Andre, and maybe one or two other guys like that. They were almost considered in their own kind of special area. And the way the older Vince promoted these guys, they would wrestle in the semifinals. They really wouldn't be considered as world heavyweight title contenders. But, with Vince Jr.'s vision, or Vincent Kennedy's vision of the future of wrestling, yeah, these guys like Hogan could be world champion, and they could be superheroes to children and fans all over the world.
I just can't help myself. I mean, there are people who are like, no, you needed to know how to work. If you wanted to wrestle Georgia, you had to go around the horn. Yeah, Blackjack Lanza was the Georgia heavyweight champion in 1979. Tell me more about how everyone needs to be a great worker. Nick, any other thoughts on the 1980? This really is the Hulk Hogan in his earliest stages. He just got the name.
Well, what's another interesting trend that you see? Look at the previous match. Pat Patterson wins with a sunset flip. Mm-hmm. Now, I grew up with a sunset flip being completely defanged. I can't remember seeing anybody win with that, with the wrestling I used to watch. It's almost like when you see a guy in a movie, like the action hero get shot in the chest, you're like, come on. fast forward to where he unbuttons the shirt, and we know he's got the Kevlar vest, and we know he's not dead. You know that sunset flip, you see that, it's like, okay, 1, 2, he's kicking out. But no, I'm watching that previous match, and it kind of threw me for a loop. Like, oh, that's right. That's a 3 count back then. That can end a match. Whereas you look at the Hulk Hogan match, what does he win with? He wins with that over-the-shoulder, backbreaker. Looks almost like a modified torture rack type maneuver. That's very much a 1980s finishing maneuver. So you kind of see the evolution of the business kind of just with these 2 matches.
One thing I've always been so big on, and this goes for every style of wrestling, whether we're talking 2023 WWF or, 90s All Japan, whatever you got, every match should have the feeling like it could be over at any second. You don't have to have this great big build-up for every match, every main event match, that this sequence that leads to the end of the match. Like, that finish, as Nick said, just kind of came out of nowhere, Steve.
Yeah, it was just very impromptu, and to pick up on what Nick was saying about the Hogan backbreaker, I don't even know if Nick would know this, but in the earlier days of Bruno Sammartino and his first reign as champion, a version of that backbreaker was actually Bruno's main finisher, the kind of over the top backbreaker like that, and I think that's what he actually beat Buddy Rogers with, was that same type of a hold. So. It's exactly what Nick was saying. These things kind of go and they come back and then they start up again. And I feel exactly like him too. I long for the day to see somebody win a match with a sunset flip. I mean, it's been way too long since we've seen that.
I think that would, I absolutely, I say this with a straight face, think that would work on an episode of Raw or AEW. And now, Nick, I hope you and people who are a little bit younger than I am will appreciate this. This is once again for my own stash and for review purposes only. This part isn't on Peacock. But we have the beginnings of the Larry Zabisco versus Bruno Sammartino situation. Now, Larry Zabisco had been 2 weeks earlier, had Bruno wanted to talk to him, and Larry just kind of brushed by him. Bruno thought, oh, Larry didn't see me, didn't hear me, whatever. The next week, Larry Zabisco just refuses to do an interview. And once again, we're kind of covering for him. Larry had just wrestled. He might have gotten hurt. He might have been winded. But now Larry Zabisco is ready to talk. He's got something on his mind. Let's hear from Larry Zabisco once again for review purposes.
If we may, Larry, if we could have a word with you, please. We certainly would appreciate it. If you step forward just a bit, we'd appreciate it. A couple of weeks ago, you were scheduled to wrestle. Indeed, were victorious, and Bruno Sammartino came out for an interview. It was a last-minute decision on the part of the producers, and I'm sure that you didn't get the word that Bruno wanted to do the interview. However, last week, indeed, the producers asked you if you would grant an interview to Bruno. You turned and walked away, and there was some contention that you were injured during the match, or your throat, or what have you, and that was the reason why you didn't want to grant the interview. But if you would clear up the controversy, we'd appreciate it.
You know, Vince, there's a lot of things I have to clear up. It took me a long time to clear it up to myself, in my own head, in my own space in this world. And professional wrestling, I want everybody to know this, professional wrestling is my life. All I do in the morning is work out and run and train. In the afternoon I travel from town to town, and at night I fight. And that is my life. And for the last couple of years, after just training to wrestle since I was 13 years old, I found myself being stifled and being held in a career that I chose for my livelihood. For the rest of my life, I want to be a professional wrestler, and I want to be the best. And the only way to do that in professional wrestling is to get ahead, is to get main events, is to meet top challengers, is to have recognition. I was trained by Bruno Sammartino, and he taught me almost everything I know. And it was very hard for me not to talk to Bruno, but I couldn't get myself to talk to the man, and I'm going to tell everybody why. And I want to make this clear to everybody. I do not hate Bruno. I do not disrespect Bruno, but I have to become Larry Zabisco to survive in my chosen field, in my career. For years now, I've been walking down the street and I've been recognized as, hey, you're the one that Bruno trained, aren't you? And I've been walking down the streets for years and people have been coming up to me and say, hey, there's Bruno's protege. And I've been getting this all over the world, not just where I live. I've even been getting it from some members of my family that introduced me. This is my nephew, the wrestler. Bruno trained him. Not even my name. And I cannot survive anymore as a professional wrestler. And this is my life. It's been very hard and I've been very depressed. And after I went overseas to Japan, I took 4 months off the whole summer and didn't wrestle anywhere because I had to think, why was I depressed and why was I down? And I couldn't get myself to realize that the man who helped me so much is now standing in my way. I cannot become Larry Zabisco, the veteran, while I'll exist in Bruno Sammartino's shadow. I don't know what to say, but I have to say what is good for me. And that is, I have to prove myself, and I deserve a chance. I've asked Bruno for many favors in the past, and I have to ask him for one more. I want to wrestle Bruno Sammartino and prove myself to the world, to the fans, and to the promoters who won't give me the recognition I'm due. I have to prove that I am better. It's my life now, and I can't get anywhere.
Well, I appreciate that, and I'm sure everyone could appreciate how you would want to prove yourself on an individual basis. Where, if you have the opportunity, would you like to meet Bruno Sammartino?
Not only would I like to meet Bruno, but I am demanding to meet Bruno. I am issuing the challenge to Bruno. Strictly scientific. I want to repeat, I don't hate Bruno. I never will hate Bruno. But this is something I have to do for my life. And whether you people can understand that and support that, that's your concern. My concern is me. Like everybody's concern must be their own, because nobody makes you happy but you. People can help you, but you have to make yourself happy. Bruno helped me when I started, but he doesn't help me in the ring now when I fight. I have to do that now. And I can't continue my career. I can't get good matches. I can't make my career the career Bruno had, because I am a shadow. I am not Larry Zabisco, the ring veteran. I have to be me in this.
So then you're hoping that you can prove yourself on an individual basis in meeting Bruno Sammartino on television or in Madison Square Garden or where?
I want to do it on television, Vince. I thought about it. I'm not after this for money. I don't want Bruno for money. I don't want money. I want self-satisfaction for myself. I want recognition for what I can do, for what I've trained for what Bruno helped me train for. I don't want money. I want it on TV. I want everybody to see it, because this is the only way I can prove myself and get myself out of my rut.
We thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Larry Zabisco, ladies and gentlemen, with his analysis of things as of late. We shall return with...
Okay, Nick, I bet that is the first time you heard that interview, and I want to get your thoughts on it. A little background. Larry Zabisco had just turned 28. He had left the WWF April 1979 after wrestling there since the very end of 1976. He went on a Japan tour, and I checked. He legitimately took the summer off. He came back to the WWF October 1979, still kind of a mid-card guy. But, Nick, what are your thoughts on Larry Zabisco? What are your thoughts on what he just said?
Here's what I think. I think that the best villains are the heroes of their own stories. And you're going to find out later on with what Zabisco does, he's definitely the villain in all this. But he's not some mustache-twirling James Bond take-over-the-world type villain. He's more like Sergeant Barnes from Platoon. He's more like Johnny Sack from The Sopranos. You know, he's a character that you can relate to. You can feel the emotion coming off of him. These are real emotions here. he's not just being evil because the script calls for it. The other thing, and this will sound a little strange, but I found myself very, very much relating to Larry Zabisco. When I actually started out of school, I went into a practice with an older doctor, and we very much had this mentor-pupil type relationship that started out great, but it fell apart pretty quickly. And for many of the same reasons here, I think he just kind of viewed me as, this guy's going to come in and be my peer. I don't think so. From my end, I kind of felt, okay, I'm never going to get anywhere with this older dentist just kind of micromanaging me, and I just felt like I had to stake out and do my own thing. So I eventually, I didn't wear his ass out with a chair, but
not yet.
Not yet. But I ended up putting in my 2 weeks notice. We parted ways, and I started my own thing. But I felt very much like Zabisco felt here. I'm never going to get anywhere under this guy's shadow. So I found this very, very relatable. And again, I found myself understanding where Zabisco was coming from.
At this point in the story arc, I feel the exact same way. By the way, as soon as someone says Johnny Sack, the first thing that goes through my head is, Ralph, Tony told you not to apologize. But anyway. I mean, to me, I get where Larry's coming from. And what really, to me, what made this interview great was like, oh yeah, someone in my family introduces me, and this guy, he's a wrestler. Bruno trained him. He didn't even use my name. Steve, what were your thoughts on this?
Well, this is the first time I've heard this too since it originally aired. Yeah, it's been a long, long time. I mean, for one thing, I can't believe they let him ramble on that long. It was very effective, but it was long. It was like an Oscar speech gone way too long. But yeah, it was extremely effective. I mean, it's very funny that as far as how the WWF and other promotions have set up these important angles. Like if you remember when Orndorff turned on Hogan, they had this little setup where they had to wrestle the Moondogs like a week or two before, and they really kind of arced out this little storyline. And years and years later, Mankind had a face-to-face interview with Jim Ross, and Mankind is really spilling his heart, and then he attacks Jim Ross, and
those were great.
These really personal interviews where a wrestler, whether he's a good guy or a bad guy, really spills out their heart and really tries to come clean and really tells you what they're thinking. They always seem to be wildly effective. It blows my mind now, years later, thinking, why didn't they ever do this again? Why didn't they ever take more time and put an angle together that would have multiple layers and have more to it than just the usual, oh my God, he threw me through the barbershop window. It was the worst thing ever happened to me.
Yeah. Now I have to go back and watch those Mankind interviews. Those were great. Someone come out and help Jim. You felt it. It felt like he really didn't know that he did it. It was great. Yeah. All right, so the next week, I believe, Bruno has something to say. Once again, this is for review purposes only. This is not on Peacock, but we have it. So let's hear what Bruno has to say.
With me now, ladies and gentlemen, Bruno Sammartino. And Bruno, I know you're in a very tough position. Wrestler extraordinaire, commentator, friend of so many fans, so many wrestlers. And I know it's tough for you to react to what has happened as of late with Larry Zabisco. But we have to put you on this spot. I think the fans certainly are deserving of an explanation of how you feel, again, about the challenge that was issued by Larry Zabisco, and will you accept his challenge? Will you face Larry Zabisco?
Well, first of all, Vince, let me tell you this, okay? I've had my neck broken, I've had my arm broken, I've had serious injuries, but none of those injuries have hurt me as hurt as I feel right now. And I feel equally bad that Larry feels hurt, which I never knew before. I never knew that he had these feelings that he has expressed. I can't tell you how terrible I feel about this whole thing, because I love the guy like a brother. I always tried my darnest to never keep holding back anything and everything that I could show him that would be beneficial to him in his career. He's been the Rookie of the Year the very first year as a pro. He's respected by all wrestlers. The fans all love him. He's been all over the world, and his promoters are always requesting to have his services again because he's such a great wrestler. I thought Larry had the world by the hand, and I thought he was the happiest guy in the world. Then to find this out, I feel crushed. I feel hurt. I feel bad for him because he feels so sad. But now you ask me, will I accept the challenge? Vince, I think you know me a long time, and I like to hope, I believe all the fans that know me for a long time know that I've never refused a challenge from anyone. But Larry Zabisco, Vince, it's like somebody asking me, Bruno, how about signing a match with your younger brother and go out there and try to hurt him, try to beat him, try to make him say, how in the world could anyone do that? I hope the fans know me.
No,
I couldn't do it. It just wouldn't be in my heart. There's no way.
Well, let me say this, that there are, and I'm not one of them, I'm just stating in effect what some fans are going to say. Some fans are going to say, Bruno, and I think you've got to face this question. They're going to say, Bruno, come on, are you afraid of Larry Zabisco? Is there a little inkling of cowardness in Bruno Sammartino? I think you're going to have to answer that question.
I hope not. I hope people won't think that way, and I hope they'll be sympathetic to my feelings in this situation. I have to repeat, those who have known me for all the years I've been around, I've faced every opponent in the world that ever came my way. But now you're asking me to meet Larry Zabisco. I repeat, I love this man like I love my own brother, my younger brother. How could I have it in my heart? Nah, if they all feel that way, I'm sorry, but there's no way. I just couldn't do it. It just isn't in me to be able to go in the ring with Larry Zabisco. I can even imagine it.
How do you feel Larry Zabisco will react to this negative vote, in effect, on your part?
I really don't know. Maybe perhaps he won't be happy. I don't know, because I don't know how to even answer that question. I just hope that he will be sympathetic enough to understand my feelings. I can understand his feeling in wanting me in there. I don't know. I'm so confused and hurt. I can't tell you.
Thanks again. Bruno Sammartino, ladies and gentlemen, with his views. We shall return.
One thing I wanted to get back to with the Larry Zabisco interview, I failed to mention this. It's in my notes. You notice the pop that Larry Zabisco gets just bringing up Bruno Sammartino's name for the first time. So in a weird way, you can see where Larry was coming from. Nick, once again, I think this is the first time you've heard this Bruno interview. You've heard this part of the storyline they're telling. What are your thoughts?
My thoughts are Bruno Sammartino obviously has good intentions, but he's only making it worse. When he starts in with he's like my little brother, I can't possibly hurt him. It's everything that is irritating and irking Zabisco. So when you're hearing him say this, he's in a very he's not in a good spot, because either way, he doesn't want to show that he's afraid of Zabisco, but on the same token, he also wants to let you know he doesn't want to hurt him. And that's about the worst thing he could say here.
I am in complete agreement. As soon as you said Bruno is making things worse, I mean, that's kind of what I thought when I was 14 years old watching this for the first time. It's like, Bruno, your matches currently have a 0% mortality rate. If you wrestle Larry Zabisco, I think he'll make it. Okay, Steve, have you heard this interview recently?
No, this is the first I've heard since I was a teenager watching it at home. But yeah, his response was good as far as just like adding more fuel, more mystery to this whole thing. Like, where is this going to go? I mean, who should we root for? What is happening? But I just wanted to add that I think looking back on now as far as history and everything, Larry was the one in real life. Larry was the one that suggested this feud to Bruno. And Bruno said, yeah, I'll do it. But when Vince's father found out about this idea, he wasn't really too keen on it. But then when this idea got back to Bruno, that McMahon, the older McMahon, didn't care for it, Bruno really sculptured this whole feud, and he put all the steps into motion, because even when he was champ, he could really do his own programs and really control everything. So I just want to give credit to Bruno for this masterpiece that we're evaluating right now.
I mean, and, going beyond that, I mean, they tell a great story coming in. I thought the match, they told a great story. I say the match, the television match. And then you go back and look at their matches that are available for Madison Square Garden and Philadelphia Spectrum, and they just do such a wonderful job storytelling the whole time. I mean, this dominated the spring and the summer of 1980. And so finally, Larry Zabisco has challenged Bruno Sammartino. He has asked for a match, and Bruno Sammartino has refused. Let's see what happens next. Once again, audio for review purposes only, and this is not available on Peacock, but let's check it out. Let's see what Larry Zabisco now has to say.
There he is. Wait a minute. Excuse me for a moment. Larry Zabisco. Let's go out and hear what he has to say. Larry, first of all, congratulations on another victory. You polished off John Buford with quite authority, no doubt about that. But you asked for this. You obviously have something to say, do you not?
I just have something to say, and I came out here a couple of weeks ago, and I poured my guts out to the fans. I made a statement of my own search and my own quest for self-recognition in my business. I made a challenge and a demand of Bruno. And I heard Bruno's reply. Bruno refused to give me the opportunity I asked for. And I hope you people enjoyed my match today, because as far as I'm concerned, if I can't have a chance to prove myself as me, this is the last match Larry Zabisco is going to wrestle. I can't exist. I am not going to exist in the business if I have to remain a shadow and a specter. I demanded something out of Bruno, and he didn't feel he should do it. I can't make Bruno do it. I can't make anybody do anything, but I can do for me. And I have to know right now, I'm not going to wrestle again. I want Bruno to come out here, and I want Bruno to say if he wants to wrestle me to my face, or if he doesn't, whatever he wants.
Bruno, please. Bruno, you've heard what Larry Zabisco has said, and everyone waiting for your response to that.
It's true that last week or 2 weeks, whatever it's been, I said that I would never wrestle Larry Zabisco, and I did mean it. However, I don't want it to be said that Larry's career may be ruined because of my refusal to go in the ring with him, number one. Number two, we've received so much mail from the fans saying that they want me to wrestle Zabisco. And all the years I've been wrestling, the fans have known me never to run away from any opponent. And I surely will not run away from this particular bout, which I really don't have my heart into it. However, there has to be a compromise here. I will go into the ring with Larry under these conditions. I will go in there to give him the opportunity to prove to the fans that he's a better man than I, if that's what he wants. Okay. For myself, I am not interested to go into that ring and defeat a Larry Zabisco. So what I will do is this. I will accommodate the fans. If they do want me to go in there, I will. I will accommodate.
You can hear the response here.
I will please Larry Zabisco into proving what's been haunting him all this time, which I had no knowledge of. However, I will say this. If Larry wants to try and beat me, fine. I will do everything in my power to stop him from beating me. As far as him trying to out-wrestle me, he'll have to be better, because I will do everything in my power to keep my reputation at stake. But what I will not do is I'm not going to go in that ring and try to defeat Larry Zabisco, because I could not find in my heart to apply a hold on him and say quit or I'll break your arm, because I still regard Larry Zabisco. I have the same love for him as I have for one of my brothers, and I do not find it in my heart to go in there and hurt Larry or try to defeat him. However, I will say this, that since Larry wanted this badly, he's going to have to show the fans and everybody and himself that he is the better man, because I will give nothing in there.
All right. The match is made, but Larry would like to get your response then.
All I can say is I cannot ask for anything else. That's all. I can't wait. I'm very happy. That's what I wanted. We'll see next week.
All right, so the match made. Larry Zabisco will face Bruno Sammartino next week.
I just want to make one more statement. I came out and I asked a favor and I got it. I just want to make sure that everybody understands I don't hate the man. I want the match on TV so everybody can see it. And that's all I have to say.
All right. Thank you both. We shall return in just a moment.
Okay, couple of things. Number one, I know at least one of you out there listening is saying, John, I listen to this podcast to hear you and Steve talk with your guests, not to listen to endless audio. It is historic stuff, and I just want, what we're recommending you watch on Peacock. This way the match doesn't exist in a vacuum. I promise there's one more audio bit, and it's coming towards the end, and that's it. I blame the WWF for letting these segments go long. Now, Dr. Nick, your thoughts on what you just heard?
This entire feud boils down to one word, and that's respect. And Larry didn't feel like he was getting it from Bruno. Larry wanted it from the fans. He didn't feel like he was getting it from the fans. Larry eventually shows none of it toward Bruno with what we'll see later. And at the end of the day, both Larry and Bruno vow to beat it into one another. So it all boils down to respect. And to me, this is just pro wrestling at its most basic, We talk about title reigns as fans, and we talk about it almost like they're real, but the title's just a prop, At the end of the day, the title's just a prop. And here, they didn't even need that. It's nothing more than two men that are fighting for respect. And that's pro wrestling broken down to its most basic elements. And listen, I'm a pro wrestling fan I like all of it. I like the Green Mist. I like the Jake Roberts biting Randy Savage with the snake angle, the Undertaker, the NWO, all that stuff. All that stuff is great. But you know what else is great is a simple story that makes sense, that's relatable, and that's about something that we all want. I mean, who doesn't want respect?
That is an excellent breakdown. Steve, before I hand it over to you, one thing I noticed for the first time listening to that is Larry Zabisco was like, okay, well, I've wrestled my last match. I hope you've all enjoyed it. And Larry gets a little bit of a Bronx cheer from the fans. And, then I noticed that Larry Zabisco, he's being a little bit heelish here. We don't see it, but Larry does not offer a handshake. He does not say thank you. He's just like, okay, I got what I wanted. That's it. Like he's not being terribly gracious, even though I still have some sympathy for him. I get where he's coming from. Like, is wrestling Bruno the only way you're going to get what you're looking for?
Yeah, John. I think he comes off like a hostage negotiator. He's just so desperate to hear Bruno say, yes, I'll have this match with you. He's just so desperate to hear those words. But, like Nick was saying, this is just, the ultimate, soap opera type storyline that, sucked in the entire East Coast. And, what was so interesting too was, we're so used to the WWF formula of, okay, they have a match at the Garden and then they have a rematch and then maybe a cage match. But what was so fascinating about this is after this TV match, they had a match at the Garden and then maybe had a rematch 2 or 3 months later. And then there was no resolution of this match. So there's just, we need to have a resolution of this match. And then they decided, hey, let's do it at Shea Stadium. And of course, the rest is history.
Yes. I mean, Nick, I agree with Nick, what both guys or Zabisco is looking for. He's just looking for a little bit of respect. Maybe he's going, now he's arm twisting a little bit. Like, hey, Bruno, I'll retire if you don't give me what I want.
He's very desperate there.
Yeah. So now we get to the match. Bruno Sammartino versus Larry Zabisco on TV. This is the biggest TV match, up until this point that I had ever seen. They really do a good job building it up. I mean, Vince McMahon is talking about, he's getting telegrams. Remember those, wishing both guys good luck. It's kind of an even match. Larry gets polite applause coming in, but Bruno gets a thunderous ovation. Nick, had you ever seen the match before I invited you to do this show?
I've seen it a few times, yeah.
Okay. Give us your thoughts on the whole back and forth.
Well, here's what I'll tell you. Here's what's interesting about it is if you look at the actual wrestling, they're not doing anything special. It's some chain wrestling, some headlocks, some hammer locks, some shoulder tackles, a couple of body slams, but it all means something. And the other interesting thing is they're both more or less kind of doing the same moves and holds, but they're doing them completely differently. Bruno is doing this match like a guy in an exhibition that's, like he said earlier, not trying to hurt Larry. It's almost a little bit dismissive. Again, you could see Larry's frustration as he goes on, because Larry is doing all these things like this is the match of his life and everything's on the line. So these two guys are just on completely different wavelengths. Bruno's looking at it like a friendly exhibition, and Zabisco is looking at this like this is his livelihood and this is the only thing that matters. And they both wrestle just like that.
My thought is, and I've expressed this on the show before, that Larry Zabisco, I don't blame him for being insulted. I do not. I mean, Bruno, it's been spelled out for Bruno Sammartino. This is Larry Zabisco's, it's beyond his Super Bowl. It is life or death for him. And Bruno is treating, and Bruno flat out is babying Larry Zabisco. You know, he puts him in a hold. Larry can't get out. Bruno lets him go. And he did this 3 or 4 times during the match. You know, Larry is body slamming Bruno with no regard for his safety, just like he would against Johnny Valiant or Nikolai Volkov. And Bruno won't do anything to even attempt to harm Larry Zabisco a little bit. And Steve, I mean, what were your thoughts on the whole thing? Like, my take was I didn't blame Larry for getting pissed.
Well, I'm trying to put myself in my 16-year-old body watching it back in the day, 15 maybe, and you know, you're watching the match, and you know, you're just caught up in it. You don't know who's going to win. You don't know what's going to happen. But when we get to that final moment, I guess as a viewer at home, I was like the people in the crowd, because you're not going to hear like lots of boos. It was more like stunned silence. Like, what did we just see? What happened? You know, so that's how I felt as a viewer. I was just stunned watching it.
Yeah, Bruno Sammartino had Larry Zabisco trapped in a bear hug. You know, and that was it. If Bruno had you in the bear hug, you're in trouble. And he just let Larry go. And I was like, Bruno, you have never killed anyone with a bear hug. Larry knows how to submit. You know, what you're doing, intentionally or not, you're embarrassing him. Like, if I'm Larry Zabisco, I am a whole lot less embarrassed just submitting to a bear hug than I am having the guy let me go. I mean, I just can't blame him.
Well, we did hear in these interviews before, Bruno did say he wasn't going to try to, you know, he didn't say I'm not going to use a finishing hold, but he said he wasn't going to try to, you know, defeat him or hurt him. He basically said this is what's going to happen in the match, so I guess he was consistent at least.
And that is an excellent point, and that's Bruno's side of the story, in that he told Larry Zabisco coming in exactly what to expect. I'm not going to try to hurt you. I'm not going to try to make you submit. You know, I will defend myself. I won't just let you beat me. So that's the other side of the coin, that Larry, you know, he agreed to that. And as we all know, it happened 43 years ago. Larry Zabisco winds up getting knocked out of the ring by accident. Bruno opens the ropes to let him back in, and Larry Zabisco just lets him have it. And he's kicking Bruno, punching him, stomping on him. And then he has not had enough. Larry Zabisco goes outside the ring, gets a wooden folding chair, hits Bruno in the head twice with it. Bruno gets up the second time, and he's enraged. Like, Bruno is shaking. His hands are shaking. And Larry Zabisco knocks him out for that third chair shot, and down goes Bruno. And we have our second wrestler of the hour taken out on a stretcher rather haphazardly. You can't mention this without saying that, yes, Bruno, I saw you blade. I saw it back in 1980. Your thoughts, Nick, on, you know, what Larry Zabisco actually did to Bruno Sammartino? Like, here we're at the end, and everyone's just stunned at what Larry Zabisco did.
I have a few thoughts on that. The first one is you got to give it up for Bruno. That was an incredible sell job on that last chair shot. Because, you know, if you see someone get knocked out in a fight, they don't take a bump off of a punch. You know what I mean? The way he goes down like a guy that really got knocked out. In fact, his head, if you watch it, his head bounces off the mat.
Yes.
And he ends up just laying there in a prone position on his stomach. You know, it looks a lot less like a wrestling bump, and it looks like this guy really got knocked out. The other thing is, and this sounds like a minor detail, but this is something that the WWF and then later, even to this day, the WWE has always done right. they're always able to find that one or two fans in the crowd just to give that perfect reaction. And if you watch this, right after Zabisco lays them out, they show these two older ladies in the crowd, and they're perfect. Because you look at them, and they look, again, they're not hooting and hollering and screaming. They're stunned. They look stunned. And when you hear these stories about, the fans when Bruno got hurt, it felt like, a family member getting hurt. And it sounds kind of silly. But when you see it on the screen, I mean, that's how these two ladies reacted. It looked like they saw a family member get knocked out. They looked stunned.
They looked like they just saw someone drive through a stop sign and crash into a truck. I mean, like that, oh my God, what did I just see look on their face. It really was a good prop. I mean, Steve, your thoughts on the whole thing. Well, let me throw mine in. At this point, now no more sympathy for Larry Zabisco. I get why he's upset, but I mean, almost killing Bruno with a wooden chair goes a little bit too far.
Yeah. The pool of blood was just so visceral and so shocking. A real pool of blood. I mean, it was just, like an inch or two of blood. You saw it on the mat. And that was it the 9 Lives of Vince McMahon show? There was a brief snippet on that show of Dr. Zahorian examining Bruno after this bloodbath, by the way. It's very interesting that that's on there. But I will say that never in my wildest dreams watching this, I mean, yeah, sure, I probably figured out, my God, this is going to be the beginning of a feud between Bruno and Larry. But never in my wildest dreams did I imagine that the feud would go on for months on end, and it would culminate with the Shea Stadium show, which at the time was the record breaker. It set all new records. I think the gate was like under $600,000. It was the biggest gate in wrestling at that time. 36,000 fans, maybe the biggest attendance at that time. And it just changed everything. So, what we're talking about is definitely wrestling history.
It is. And one thing, I don't have this audio, but Bruno Sammartino would get on TV and talk about how he spent time away from his family, away from his 2 sons, away from his wife in order to train this Larry Zabisco, and look what he has done. And then Bruno, he returns to his role as color commentator, but when Larry Zabisco was on TV wrestling, Bruno would go silent. He would just be like, nope, I have nothing to say. And it made the thing feel that much more real.
Yeah, you really believed in this feud. It was really different than the regular wrestling angles that we had seen, where, yeah, we were vested in them and we were definitely caught up, and we definitely wanted to go to see them live and see them wrestle. But this was so personal. You really felt it much more internally and personally.
I completely agree. So after that, we have more matches. Incredibly. But now, okay, so the next match, Tony Atlas against Johnny Rodz. And now I see why we have that next match, because we have that visual of the referees cleaning up that pool of blood with white towels, and you see the towels are soaked with Bruno Sammartino's blood. I mean, it was quite the visual. Nick, any thoughts from you?
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned that, because when I'm first watching this through, because I watched this a few times in preparation for this, but when I'm watching the whole show through, I'm watching this, and this is strange. Why is this in the middle of the show? Shouldn't this be at the end? Because, again, that's what I'm used to, and I think if this angle were done nowadays, that's how they would do it. It would be a cliffhanger at the end of the show. What's going to happen next week? But here's the thing. This is a much, much better way of doing it, because, like you said, not only do you have that visual of them cleaning the pool of blood up out from the corner of the ring, you also get to see the audience. They're kind of just shocked for the rest of the show. And the next 2 matches, I mean, anything that happens in the ring is more or less irrelevant, but you get the crowd reaction to it. And I think the story deserved that, because one thing that's very, very easy to lose sight of is, even though all these moving parts kind of happen fairly quickly, this mentor-pupil relationship, this wasn't like a 3-month relationship or a 6-month angle or a 2-year angle. This, Bruno broke him in. This was 7 years, I believe, in the making, was it not?
Exactly 7 years.
Mm-hmm. Exactly 7 years. So, again, to do it like a cheap cliffhanger, tune in next week, I think they gave it the respect and just the attention to detail that this angle deserved.
The way they did it now today, or even, coming in, I'm like, all right, the last thing we should see is Bruno Sammartino on his way back to the dressing room on a stretcher. But wait a minute. That's how things happen in a perfect world where everything is planned. The way they did it made it seem unplanned, like no one knew this was going to happen, and we've got 2 more matches to go. Steve, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, when Bruno was carried off and Tony Altamore was one of the referees that sloppily carried him off on the stretcher, I think you get to see a little bit of Monsoon on the sidelines standing there as he was directing the TV at the time. It was so in the moment and so shocking. I mean, like Nick said, I mean, you're just watching these other matches, the Bobby Duncum squash match, the Tony Atlas squash match, and you're watching the fans who are all numb, and you're just wondering, like, where do we go from here? I mean, you've just seen an assassination attempt. Where do we go from here?
Yeah, and like you said, a hush had fallen over the crowd for the last 2 matches. And, it just made the gravity of the whole thing sink in. Now, getting off the Bruno Zabisco thing for a minute, Tony Atlas, Steve, is custom made for the World Wrestling Federation, a big bodybuilder with a lot of charisma. Maybe not much in the ring, but he's got his strong points.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that was great about the old WWF, with the extra W, I mean, they always had great stars from all over the world and different cultures, and they weren't afraid to push black wrestlers. I mean, Bobo Brazil had been a huge star, which is really forgotten now. He was a huge star for the WWF back in the 60s and through parts of the 70s. Now, Bobo was pretty much almost retired by now. He would come back for little sporadic runs, but Tony Atlas was really going to be his replacement, a star for the people to root for, and had a phenomenal body. And he wasn't really a great wrestler, but he definitely had the look for the WWF, where bodies and just larger than life personas were definitely looked upon in a very positive nature.
Yeah, Bobo Brazil had been gone since the beginning, or at least off TV, since the beginning of 1977, and we had no baby faces as persons of color who got pushed in the WWF. Yeah, Ernie Ladd came back in 78, but he's a bad guy, and that's something that I just looked at the time being like, okay, there are black people in every other sport except WWF wrestling. But any thoughts, Nick, on the Tony Atlas versus Johnny Rodz match itself, or any thoughts on either competitor?
I just think Johnny Rodz was going about this thing all wrong, because if you watch that match back, half of his offense is him kicking and stomping Tony Atlas in the head, and I don't know, I've seen Tony Atlas put out some videos that suggest to me, I think Johnny Rodz may have just been threatening him with a good time there. Here's the other thing I'll say, and this is going to sound kind of silly, but I remember as a kid, my family, they tend to not be wrestling fans, and all I heard was fake, the stuff's phony, scripted. But in my mind, I thought, I'm going to make my own decision on this. So I would kind of watch this stuff a little bit analytically. And of all things, the thing that kind of got me as a kid, and I was probably 8 or 9, to realize, hey, this stuff is scripted, were the headbutts. Because I watched a lot of boxing with my dad, and if you ever watch a fight where someone just takes an accidental headbutt, I mean, that thing just opens a huge gash on the eye, and they stop the fight half the time. So when you see that, and then you see these guys doing these diving, jumping, falling, flopping headbutts, and it doesn't leave a scratch, for whatever reason, that of all things was what told me, okay, I think this is scripted. All that said, never made a difference to me.
No, same here. I mean, if you're a wrestling fan, especially from that era, you get it. You just understand, and you're either drawn to it or you're not. Bobby Duncum against Steve King. We talked a little bit about Steve King earlier. Bobby Duncum is still in the middle of a big push in the WWF. He had already gotten 2 matches at Madison Square Garden against Bob Backlund at the end of 1979, but he is still main eventing in Boston, in Philadelphia, in Baltimore, etc. against Bob Backlund. I felt like this was one too many matches. This match should have been on earlier in the card, and we should have just gone home after Tony Atlas and Johnny Rodz. I mean, the air has been sucked out of the building. But Steve, any thoughts on Bobby Duncum?
Well, Bobby Duncum had made his name in the Federation back in '74. He had this really, they called it in the wrestling magazines, Bloodbath at the Garden match at MSG against Bruno, and Bruno defeated him in the rematch. And Bruno has said in the years subsequent that Bobby Duncum was probably maybe one of his most underrated opponents. They really liked wrestling with each other, and he became a real AWA mainstay, teaming up with Blackjack Lanza a lot. So he had a really strong career. I know in the Backlund book, Backlund said that Bobby Duncum's knees were really failing him at the time, but I think he also said in the book that Bobby Duncum's wife was quite ill around this time. And it wasn't like he could just quit wrestling. He needed to make the big income that he was making in New York. So even though he was really maybe not up to speed like he used to be, they were more than happy to give him some main events to make the money that he needed to get through a difficult time. So the McMahons, they definitely, at least in that time, were first-class outfit.
I was really surprised they took this long to bring Bobby Duncum back, because he was a big star in the WWF 74 and 75. But like you said, I mean, what Bruno Sammartino actually said about Bobby Duncum was that Bobby was the best athlete he had ever been in the ring with. I'm like, doing an inventory of some of the guys Bruno has wrestled, both in the United States and Japan, and that's a hell of a compliment, man. But I saw Bobby Duncum in 1987. He was wrestling in Indy in New Jersey, and the poor guy could barely move. So we know his knee issues have really kicked in here. Nick, how familiar were you with Bobby Duncum coming in, and what did you think of him in this match?
I wasn't really too familiar with him, but I'm kind of with you. It didn't really make too much sense to put this match on at the very end. I think you could have had just one more match for, the visual of the blood in the corner and the crowd, kind of just being deflated. I think this was one match too many. That said, I mean, he wrestles like he looks. He looks like a big, tough Texan-type guy that's just going to squash you. And he kind of wrestles that way. That bulldog he does, that looked pretty legit. But, yeah, I just felt like this match, didn't even need to be here, or it could have maybe been a little bit earlier on the card before the Bruno Larry.
Yeah, Bruno, I mean, I'm thinking about what I said about Duncum. I mean, thinking about the guys, Bruno was comparing him to. And then again, Bobby Duncum legit played football at the University of Texas, so you know how good you have to be to do something like that. But yeah, he was, for the most part, he was a one-and-done challenger against Bob Backlund. I thought his match 12/19/79 against Bob Backlund at Madison Square Garden was terrible. I know some of you might not have been expecting me to say that, but it was a bad match. Just Bob had good matches and Bob had bad matches, and that was one of them. All right, we're leaving the February 2nd, 1980 Championship Wrestling show, but we have one more piece of audio just to kind of wrap things up, and here's what Larry Zabisco had to say 2 weeks after he put the chair to Bruno Sammartino.
With me at the moment now, ladies and gentlemen, Larry Zabisco.
Hey, Bruno isn't coming, is he? Everybody here wants Bruno. Bruno isn't coming out, is he?
All right, look. Larry Zabisco, you have absolutely destroyed the faith that so many wrestling fans have placed in you. It seems to me that you've done such an injustice to so many, many fans who really looked up to you.
The fans don't know the truth, and I can see where the fans are coming from. I can see where Bruno is coming from. But if everybody looks around when they're screaming, we want Bruno, we don't see Bruno coming, do we? And I'll tell you why we don't see Bruno coming. Because Bruno found out he couldn't embarrass me in this ring. Bruno couldn't use me anymore to keep his name going.
He labeled me, don't lip off to me. He used me as his protege, and it kept his name alive. We used to train together for years, and unbeknownst to everybody here, he could never beat me when we trained together, and that's why he used this match as an excuse.
I'll wait. Please don't go away.
Let's wait. Look at.
All right, now let's talk about the match that you had with Sammartino on television.
Yeah, let's talk about it.
All right.
I challenged Bruno to a scientific wrestling match. Bruno says, oh my God, am I shocked? He is so shocked he can't believe it. Let me tell you why he's so shocked. Because Bruno doesn't want to come on TV and let everybody know that he is not the living legend of wrestling, that he never beat Larry Zabisco in practice, that I've got a name I can carry on for myself better than Bruno Sammartino ever made his damn name. Okay. No, I'm talking here. Everybody thinks they're so smart. Well, you ask yourself, how come Bruno Sammartino agreed to the type of match he did? How come he wouldn't keep a hold on me? Because he knows I can break out of every single hold he put on me. There is not a hold a man can put on me that I can break out of. I can break out of them all. Well, Bruno, he tried to embarrass me in the ring by pretending that he was letting me go. He let me go and broke the hold because he didn't want everybody out in television land to see me get out of it for my own self.
All right. Assuming that we accept what you say, what then do you have to say for yourself for the conduct that you used and the actions that you showed here using the chair that you used? How do you explain that?
I want to tell you something. Bruno used me. I found it out. You people are ignorant and you don't know, and who cares anyway? But I know what he was doing. Nobody comes in this ring and humiliates me and laughs at me and tries to make me look like a complete fool. And when I picked up that chair, that was my way of telling Bruno, nobody does that to me. And if everybody here wants to know the truth, when I hit him with the chair, that was the happiest moment of my life, everybody. Because now I am Larry Zabisco, and everybody knows it. And what you people think, I could care less. Bruno knows the truth, and I know the truth.
Here's a man. How could you possibly say that? Here's a man, by his own words, who loved you like a brother.
Yeah, he loves me like a brother, and the next breath he's humiliating me in the ring. You think I couldn't have put Bruno in a hold and let him go like a big joke? I could have done the same thing to him. He's the one that did it to me, and he's the one that asked for it. You people don't know what you're talking about, so why don't you just shut up and let someone in the business tell you what the hell's going on?
You appear to be a very uptight wrestler. You obviously do not have the respect of the fans any longer, Larry Zabisco. I would think that certainly that would be on your mind as well.
Yeah, well, you know what? I've learned a long time ago that for the last 7 years I ran into the ring and people screamed and yelled, and I signed, autographed, and kissed their slobbering little babies, and they thought it was great. And to tell you the truth, I really didn't mind. But I came over here for a match with Bruno, and as far as I'm concerned, he let me down, and the people that are all watching wrestling let me down too. And I don't need them, I don't need Bruno, I don't need anybody.
So what happens in the future?
Hey, in the future, my future is set. I have proved myself on television. They carried Bruno out. He couldn't stop me. He couldn't stop me scientifically. That's why he used this crummy little gimmick match of releasing all the holds like he's just a nice guy. And I'm using mine now. My future is made. Anybody wants to wrestle Larry Zabisco, it's fine with me. I wrestle scientific all the time. Just help for all the time.
Thank you very much, Larry Zabisco.
Okay, once again, anytime we use audio here on Stick to Wrestling, it is for review purposes only. And while I'm speaking, Don't Lip Off to Me is definitely going to be the name of this episode. Vince McMahon in total Howard Cosell mode once again. One of my favorite things about wrestling, Nick, is you can turn into a completely different person overnight, just as Larry Zabisco has in 2 weeks.
Yes, but there's enough meat on the bone here that you can work with it. And it kind of seems like a real heel turn. It's not a sudden thing out of nowhere. And again, you can understand some of where he's coming from. Did Bruno try to humiliate him? Not necessarily. He really wasn't giving him a whole lot of respect out there. So he takes the truth and then he stretches it and distorts it and turns it into his own warped version. And that is a much more interesting villain. I'll take a villain like that any day over, again, someone that's just evil because the script calls for it. I think this is a great heel promo because he starts it up with telling the audience, hey, you know, that guy you really, really want to see, he's not here. I took him from you, and I'm going to take his name while I'm at it. He's the next living legend.
I mean, I agree with you 100%. I thought Larry Zabisco's persona was fantastic here. You know, that it's almost like he got pushed into going to the other side, and he just said, you know what, I'm going to embrace it. I mean, here he is talking out both sides of his mouth. Yeah, I could have gotten out of the hold, but Bruno was trying to humiliate me. Steve, your thoughts on this interview?
He is so extremely effective as a heel. I mean, it's like the very best of Roddy Piper. It's like MJF today. I mean, this is a guy that people just want to kill and just see him get run over by a car. And but it's like lightning in a bottle. I mean, he's kind of like Super Joe Charbonneau. He's like he would never hit these heights again. This would only last really just, you know, a bunch of months this year. He'd milk the rest of his career off of the Bruno feud and the feud with Bockwinkel and Wahoo. But you know, the future of Larry Zabisco is always going to be about 1980 and what happened. And in a way, it's a shame because he could really wrestle well. He was a good wrestler, a great talker, but because his body was like a 70s wrestler body, he got lost in the shuffle and nobody wanted to push a real wrestler anymore. They were more interested with Anabolic Warrior and guys that look like him.
Yeah, Larry Zabisco, he had some moments in the AWA, in WCW with JCP, but really this was Larry Zabisco. I mean, nothing in his career compared to that. Larry has claimed that the WWF blackballed him after he refused to go out at Chase Stadium until he got more money. That claim to me is dubious, even though he never wrestled for the WWF after this tour. I say that because they booked him in main events at the Philadelphia Spectrum against Bob Backlund in October and November of 1980. So that's, you know, a heck of a way to blackball a guy. But I always took that story with a very large grain of salt.
Well, the thing that Larry has said is that, you know, after the Bruno feud was over and he was, say, wrestling Pedro Morales, the fact that Bruno had never pinned Larry in all those matches that they had, he didn't want to have, say, Pedro pin him or maybe a lesser wrestler pin him because Bruno never pinned him. And his excuse was, well, that's going to make Bruno look bad. And so he really tried to have the promotion over a barrel and it just kind of blew up in his face. And I think he kind of got blackballed for a little bit. I mean, he ended up in Georgia a couple of years later, and his career eventually found its way. But I think it's very interesting about Bruno's story because Bruno had held the WWF World title for most of the 60s, for more than half of the 70s. And after all of that and all that goodwill that Bruno put forward and having his neck broken and other things, he gives them the biggest show in the history of the Federation. And then they find a way to screw him on the payoff. And that led to a lawsuit. And that's what led to him coming back as an announcer. He got a 6-figure deal to come back as an announcer in 84. And his son David could come back with him. So it's a very interesting story that this 1980 plays in all of that.
Yeah, I mean, Nick, Steve, thank you for being on. We've done an extra long episode. I feel like I can hang out with both of you guys and talk to you all day. Thank both of you very much. Nick, thank you for coming back after, I believe, 8 or 9 months.
I'll be back anytime you want me, man. I had a great time. This was very enjoyable. And like I said earlier, my parents are going to have another wrestling podcast to listen to. So
yeah, almost a 2-hour wrestling podcast. Steve, I'm glad we were able to reunite this week, and hopefully we'll be able to do it again next week.
Oh, great job, John. And thank you, Nick. And Lou, is great job as always.
All right. And I want to thank everyone for listening. I want to thank Brian Last for giving me this forum, if you will. I want to thank Lou for doing all of the great work he does. Lou Kipilman is the Bobby Grich of pro wrestling producers. He is so underrated, and his work, it just does not get enough credit. And we actually had a Joe Charbonneau reference on Stick to Wrestling finally. after almost 250 episodes. We'll see all of you next week, and this has been a production of the Arcadian Vanguard Podcast Network.
This concludes our podcast day.